Welcome to this presentation entitled What Does Civil Rights Mean in the 21st Century? A Reclamation of the Proclamation. I want to dedicate this discussion to Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr., whose birthday we recently celebrated, recognized, and honored, and the late great Nelson Mandela, who passed away at age 95 on December 5th. I played a drum beat, an African drum beat, at the beginning of this YouTube in order to remind us of Africa, the motherland, where civil rights should never have been an issue. The beat of the African drums serve as a subtle reminder of our beginnings, our past. It is the richness of that past that serves as an inspiration to artists to capture the spirit of history through music, art, drama, and yes, the cinema. I really don't think it is by accident that producers are educating the general public about this subject through movies such as Tate Taylor's The Help, Lee Daniels' The Butler, and Steve McQueen's 12 Years a Slave. Earlier, we had stories of slavery in the movies Roots and the autobiography of Miss Jane Pittman, to mention a couple. These movies emphasize a particular era in Negro history. They also direct me to place my discussion with you today in a context that will hopefully bring clarity and meaning to the civil rights movement and inspire us to look with hope and great expectations to a future of freedom and peace. In order to achieve this goal, I chose to go back to the beginnings that are not always included in the curriculum or in our history books. The facts that I will share with you are primarily sourced from John Hope Franklin and Alfred A. Moss, Jr., their book entitled From Slavery to Freedom, the 6th edition. Now, when I speak of or relate to the topic, some essential facts in the history of the the American Negro, from the ancient African beginnings down to the present time, include a focus on West Africa and the emergence of independent states such as Ghana, Mali, and Songhay. This is an incomplete listing of states or the independent states in Africa because there were many more such states in West Africa. To a greater or lesser degree, all of them had some connection with the inhabiting of the New World with black people. In the above referenced text, Franklin and Moss, Jr. describe the African way of life through their political institutions, their economic life, social organization, religion, and the arts. Through the transplantation of African culture, first through European and Asian continents, and then moving to the New World, we see this New World with vast natural resources and its underdeveloped regions that would make slavery and the slave trade quite profitable. The voyage to the Americas, popularly referred to as the Middle Passage, was a veritable nightmare. Franklin and Moss report that there are records of ships as small as 90 tons carrying a complement of 390 slaves in addition to crew and provisions. The practice of overcrowding slaves became so common that the British Parliament felt compelled to specify that not more than 5 slaves could be carried for every 3 tons of the burden of a ship of 200 tons. This regulation, like so many others, was not enforced, because to the Americas, more slaves meant greater profits, and few traders could resist the temptation to wedge in a few more. There was hardly standing, lying, or sitting room in which to move about, and no freedom to exercise their bodies even in the slightest. Although the clarity of this diagram that I'm going to show you right now, it's a slave ship. It's not very clear, but you can get a good idea of what this situation looked like. You can see the darkness in the diagram illustrating bodies, if you will, people, if you will. Any reference to Black history that goes back to West Africa will show these diagrams and tell you more about the conditions on the slave ships. The vast majority of the slaving was carried on in the area of West Africa, where civilization had reached its highest point on the continent, with the possible exception of Egypt. Negroes were first used on the tobacco plantations of the Caribbean islands, and in some places, blacks outnumbered whites. One important ingredient in the seasoning process was the overseer's lash. The point to remember is that it is virtually impossible to speak of slavery other than in terms of its inhumanity, and that few institutions, including the churches, did anything to mitigate its fundamental cruelties and the insensitivity of one person who had complete dominion over another. Now, moving along, we come to what was referred to as colonial slavery. When it comes to colonial slavery, we find that it began, however, not in the legal sense, because these people were called indentured servants, but we say that it began or history says that it began in 1619 when a Dutch frigate landed 20 Africans ashore at Jamestown. And when the need for labor became more severe, Virginia saw the need to use the blacks for that labor. The actual statutory recognition of slavery in Virginia came in 1661, and likewise in Maryland in 1663. In the 18th century, they grew at an alarming rate. In some places, again, as with the Caribbean, blacks outnumbered whites. So control became necessary. Remember that I mentioned the seasoning process earlier. That was the overseer's lash. Now, coupled with that now is the manifestation of what was described as the slave codes. Some of these regulations included slaves not even being permitted to leave the plantations without the written permission of their masters. If they were found guilty of murder or rape, they would be hung. For offenses such as robbing a house or a store, they would receive 60 lashes and be placed in the pillory where their ears would be cut off. For petty offenses such as insolence and associating with whites or associating with free Negroes, they were to be whipped, branded, and or maimed. In 1695, there could be no frequent meetings of Negroes. Under no conditions were they to learn how to read and write. Slavery spread to the Carolinas and Georgia, and then into the middle colonies. However, not really successful in the middle colonies, which were those colonies were identified as New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Delaware. Negroes in New England were in a unique position in colonial America because they were not subjected to the harsh codes or the severe treatment that their fellows received in the colonies of the South. Now I'm going to pause a moment because someone may be asking the question or have the question on their minds. What does this have to do with what I chose as a subject for this presentation, which is okay. What does civil rights mean in the 21st century? A reclamation of the proclamation. My discussion is going to lead up to the proclamation, but going back to look at the subject, I just really don't think that we can talk about civil rights in the 21st century without really going back to see what the roots of all of this was. Why was there discontent in this era that's referred to as the civil rights era? What events led up to that? What was the climate like of what had transpired prior to the civil rights era for there even to be a need for what happened in the civil rights era. So that is why I am sharing this information with you, because it started, I feel, back with the whole institution of slavery and how slavery started, how it progressed, and that sort of thing, because that set the tone and that set the framework for individuals when we look back at blacks, African Americans, Negroes, whatever the case may be, what the feeling was leading up to the civil rights era. So let me continue. By the middle of the 18th century, slavery in the United States was an integral part of a maturing economic system. It was met by uprisings such as the one led by Crispus Attucks and the Shea Rebellion in Massachusetts. At the same time, Great Britain still had a hold over the colonies because they were providing them with a source of income. Great Britain was providing the American colonies with a source of income. So the colonists became more and more intolerant with the money that was demanded from Great Britain and the various acts that were passed to eliminate this support. So after the Boston Tea Party and the subsequent intolerable acts, 2 of the 13 colonies called the First Continental Congress and agreed to boycott British goods. At the Second Continental Congress, all 13 colonies attended and drafted the Declaration of Independence, which was approved on July 4, 1776, which incidentally did not address slavery, but it addressed independence from England. So no longer being controlled by Britain, on March 2, 1807, the law prohibiting the African slave trade was passed. Then came a period of acculturation and the search for independence and the domestic slave trade and slave breeding. Without slavery and the slave trade, the westward movement on the southern frontier would have been unsuccessful. This is according to the sources that I mentioned to you earlier. Cotton and slavery were the great transforming forces. The farm became a plantation, which in turn became a rural factory with the impersonality of a large-scale economic organization. It is estimated that only 400,000 slaves lived in towns and cities in 1850. This left approximately 2.8 million to do the work on the farms and the plantations. The great bulk of them, 1.8 million, were to be found on cotton plantations, while the remainder were primarily engaged in the cultivation of tobacco, rice, and sugar cane. Conditions were unsatisfactory to the Negroes. So hence the rise of abolitionists, those people who worked to free the Negroes, and others who spoke out on slavery. It was a catalyst to the production of the Underground Railroad. And yes, the Underground Railroad was not a railroad per se, but a passage to free the Negroes, tunneling through many states in the United States from the south to the north, looking for freedom. These routes, again, they began on the various plantations of the south, and they led to the north. Moving along now from colonial slavery to the Civil War that was fought between the years of 1861 and 1865, and leading to the Emancipation Proclamation. Research reveals that the top 5 causes of the Civil War that lasted from 1961 to 1865 were economic and social differences between the North and South, states versus federal rights, the fight between slave and non-slave proponents, the growth of the abolitionist movement, and the election of Abraham Lincoln. At this point, I'd like to show you a YouTube video that highlights these causes as I have shared with you. There were references in the YouTube video about Reconstruction and after Reconstruction. If we look at Reconstruction, which has been referred to as happening between 1850 and 1877, the end of war was to bring about peace, the Civil War. As important as the war itself was, the tangled problem of how to reconstruct the defeated South, there was this problem. Encouraged by the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution, African Americans at last nourished hope for full equality. Their hopes were to be dashed because by 1877, Southern white resistance and the withdrawal of federal supervision brought about the redemption of the South, and African Americans were disenfranchised. The redemption measures enforced greater racial separation and increased white intimidation and violence. After the Reconstruction, there was a movement to disenfranchise the Negro, in other words, white supremacy. There was little improvement in the economic and social status of the Negro, and despite the opposition of many white Southerners to Negro schools, there seemed to be a greater willingness to tolerate the growing educational institutions than any of the other agencies that Negroes established in order to improve themselves. With this growth came philanthropy and the historically black colleges and universities. Violence was noted through the organization KKK. An antidote to that was the organization NAACP. Then you had the World War I, 1914 to 1918. And after World War I, the NAACP took the lead in setting up a program of assault against bigotry and injustice in America. You had the Harlem Renaissance, where socio-economic problems and Afro-American literature was being introduced or were being introduced at the time. The flight of Negro farmers from the farms of the South to industry in the North began. You had a political regeneration with President Roosevelt's New Deal and the Black Cabinet. You had Social Security Board being established in 1935. And the trends in education were as follows. For the first half of the 20th century, the bulk of Negro children in school at all attended impoverished, small, short-term schools with pronounced inadequacies in every phase of the educational program. In the 1970s, there was a requirement by the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare that institutions have affirmative action programs in connection with their hiring practices. This caused a stir even today. And there was the importance of the church in Negroes, in the lives of Negroes. After, as we continue to move through history, after World War II, there was a drive for equality in several significant ways. President Harry Truman contributed to the creation of a climate in which the status of blacks could be improved. In 1946, he appointed a committee of distinguished black and white Americans to inquire into the condition of civil rights and to make recommendations for their improvement. The push for equality was in public housing, employment opportunities, school desegregation, transportation, registering, and voting. Urbanization affected black families and the church. There was a flourishing of black businesses. There was writers, artists, scholars, music, television, motion pictures, sports. All efforts met with opposition and violence for the most part from the segregationists. Negroes were increasingly impatient. Now this is after World War II. Impatient with the intransigence of the opponents of civil rights. They became bolder and more aggressive and began to press for their rights with relentless vigor. An example is the boycotting of the Montgomery buses. Bringing us now to civil rights. These are the rights that every person should have regardless of his or her sex, race, or religion. They are non-political rights of a citizen, especially the rights of personal liberty guaranteed to United States citizens by the 13th and 14th Amendments to the Constitution and by other acts of Congress. Now let's talk about the Civil Rights Movement. During the Civil Rights era in the United States, groups and individuals worked to end racial segregation and the unequal treatment of African Americans. This plight was led by prominent figures such as Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. There were protesters and organizers who used grassroots campaign and legal means to transform this nation and to seek a brighter future for all Americans. The Civil Rights Movement began as a grassroots effort in local communities, but eventually drew national attention to the racial discrimination and disenfranchisement of African Americans, particularly in American South. Exploring some of the key events and milestones that define this era, we would look at the Brown versus Board of Education, 1954, the Montgomery boycott, bus boycott in 1955, the integration of Central High School in 1957, the Greensboro sit-in and the sit-in movement in 1960. Then there were the Freedom Rides, the integration of Ole Miss, the March on Washington, the Birmingham bus bombings, Freedom Summer, Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Selma to Montgomery March in 1965, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. in 1968. There were many different civil rights legislations and um, court decisions. I want to take you now to the 21st century. The basic thing that I want you to see is that while this period, the protest phase of the civil rights movement, represented a frontal attack on the doctrine and practice of white supremacy, it did not defeat the monster of racism. The roots of racism are very deep in this country. Martin Luther King made that statement in 1968. Perhaps he wondered how long it would be before African Americans would truly be able to access the civil rights gained through his nonviolent methods of the 1960s. The Civil Rights Acts of the 1960s were great breakthroughs. Not only did they afford African Americans legal rights that every American should have, they provided for enforcement of some of the laws by the federal government. And by the early 1970s, federal agencies had followed suit, instituting directives, policies, and training on race relations and equal opportunities. Let's go to the civil rights issues of today. Today, some issues continue to be in the forefront of the civil rights struggle, while others are new. Here are some selected current issues. Let's take education to begin with. One area where some believe educational opportunities are not equal is in gifted programs. African Americans appear to be overrepresented in special education programs, but very few participate in gifted programs. Donna Y. Ford of the University of Virginia believes this is because of the tools used to identify children as gifted and stressors felt by African American children. The tool used by the vast majority of states to identify gifted students is an IQ or achievement test, which doesn't take into account different learning styles, test anxiety, environment, etc. Ford advocates a variety of different means of identifying gifted students, from teacher involvement to grades. The United States Department of Education's Office of Civil Rights is currently working with the state of Georgia to change the way the state identifies gifted students. Currently, selection is based only on IQ scores. The legislative barriers broken during the civil rights movement have not yet translated into equal accomplishments in education. Since 1960, the number of African Americans who completed 4 or more years of high school has more than tripled, yet still lagging behind white students. Although this gap is not wide in high school, white Americans complete 4 or more years of college at twice the rate of African Americans. The next issue is voting rights. August 6, 1995 was the 30th anniversary of the Voting Rights Act, and it caused many to reflect. Just a year earlier, there had been a landmark decision concerning redistricting. In Miller v. Johnson, the Supreme Court ruled 5-4 to uphold a district court's decision that redistricting resulted in 3 black majority districts was unlawful because race was the determining factor in the makeup of the districts. When race is an issue, however, we have recognized the need for judicial intervention to prevent dilution of minority voting strength. Another issue is housing. Housing discrimination still exists. The question is how widespread it is. A recent special report called True Colors by the ABC News show Prime Time with Diane Sawyer followed two men, one white and one black, through their test transitions to moving to a new city. In their search for housing, hidden cameras made the results very obvious. For example, when an apartment was not available for the African American, it was available for the other man an hour later. This kind of discrimination was evident over the course of their housing search. So there are many, many cases to emphasize that this is still a problem in the United States. Economic issues. We've won the right. We've won the battle for the right to vote. We've won the battle against segregation. We've won the battle to go to schools of our choice. We have not won the battle in terms of money, the economic challenge. In 1994, approximately a third of all black families were below the poverty level, while less than 1/10 of all white families were below the poverty level. So economic issues are prevalent today. Where do we see ourselves today? If the civil rights movement has achieved its goals, why do so few African Americans feel they do not have the same opportunities as whites? An Associated Press poll conducted in 1998 showed that 6 out of 10 white persons believed African Americans have an equal opportunity. 7 of 10 African Americans polled did not agree. In the same poll, 1 of every 3 people thought the United States has not done enough since the civil rights movement of the 1960s. An article about the cost of integration in the Oakland Post states that when African Americans move into white neighborhoods, many African American businesses could not follow and had to close. Also, when African Americans all lived in the same neighborhood, young African Americans had a variety of role models day after day. Today, some poor young African Americans don't see other African Americans who have attended college. According to this article, this has brought about a generation of alienated and hopeless youth. The last point relates to integration in schools. According to the article, African American children have lost much of the African American history previously taught when the class was only comprised of African Americans. We could have thoughts on the past. We could have thoughts on the civil rights movement, the killing of civil rights workers. We could acknowledge the dark corners of our past. We could look at the successes that were a result of pushing forward on the United States for an improved situation. We could look at the Montgomery bus boycott. But when we look at, or today, when people young and old reflect on the movement, often their views differ, but they retain the same theme. What do you see as the greatest contribution of Martin Luther King Jr. and the civil rights movement? And there have been mixed responses on that. So if we look at the, first of all, what the proclamation, what the words of the proclamation said to us way back when, and we look at today, 150 years later, I would ask you, what do you see as the greatest contribution of Dr. Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s? And if we have time for Q's and A's, I'd like to begin that now, the interaction with the audience. I don't have all the answers, so there may be questions that some of the rest of you can answer. but I would like to engage in discussion throughout the rest of my time. As we conclude, I would conclude with this. Can we expect to ever live in a perfect world? Racism may never be fully eliminated from our society, but it would never have been challenged if those who took part in the civil rights movement did not have the courage and desire to make all of our lives better.